NexCentra Consulting, and also chair of the Science and Standards Committee at GINN. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers and GINN for giving us this platform today and putting together what I hope you'll agree is going to be a fantastic panel. Lots of experience in the field of science, regulation and product innovation. And with that, I'm going to ask each of the members just to give a quick 1-minute introduction to yourselves. So, Paweł.
Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to see you here. I'm part of the R&D team at Chemnovatic in Poland. My field of research is mainly impurities in nicotine and nicotine extract and removing them. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this panel session today. Thank you.
I'm Sydney Hiller. I'm a senior scientist with Sanova. We do, I don't know if this is on. It's on? I'm a senior scientist with Sanova. We do scientific and regulatory consulting. My background is similarly in chemistry before I transitioned into the regulatory space, and we will do whether it's full service end-to-end PMTA applications or other international submissions as well.
Hi, is this working? My name's Joel Rubenstein. I'm a bit of a free agent right now, but I've spent the past 10 years running NRT businesses. So I've been in the pharmaceutical nicotine business on the commercial side for the past decade or so, a little over a decade now. Working on everything from go-to-market strategy, product development, working very closely with regulatory filings to launch new brands and product development.
Cool, thank you very much, guys. So I think before we go on and start talking about the future of all nicotine products, I wanted to first have a quick look at the history. And you know, I understand whilst not popular in the world, it's really important to understand that oral nicotine is not new. Oral nicotine through the chewing of tobacco has been around for millennia. I think you know some of the cave drawings in some Central America caves actually show tobacco being used as a chewed product alongside smoking tobacco. So as we talk about nicotine pouches for tobacco harm reduction, we often tend to focus just on the smokers and how can we get smokers to switch to nicotine pouches as a harm reduction technique. But it's also important to remember that there's a massive market of oral tobacco users out there that can also benefit from switching to nicotine pouches. And someone who's been in the tobacco harm reduction field for the last 24 years, sometimes I feel that gets a bit neglected and the focus seems to be only on smokers. So I just wanted to say that I think it's really important that we also think about replacing other oral tobacco products with nicotine pouches. Now, as we talk about oral nicotine pouches, I'm sure you've all seen a version of this diagram before, the harm reduction spectrum, often used to describe how different nicotine products compare to combustible cigarettes. As we know, cigarettes is the most dangerous way of consuming nicotine. If you get rid of the combustion, you lower the risk. If you get rid of the tobacco, you lower the risk further. And if you lower the need for inhalation, you have a product which essentially culminates in nicotine pouches, which is a product which has a very similar risk profile to pharmaceutical nicotine replacement therapies, which of course have been around for the last 50 years and are generally accepted by all doctors around the world as a replacement for smoking. So the question that I think we need to start with today is why are nicotine pouches treated differently from NRT? And Sydney, I was wondering whether you could tell us about what regulation looks like around the world when it comes to nicotine pouches.
Absolutely. So obviously we can't get around the entire world in just a couple of minutes that we have. So I'll highlight some of the key spaces, one of which is the United States, where you have the full pre-market tobacco authorization PMTA pathway, which we're currently seeing quite a few potential shifts in with some expeditions with pouches for whether it's PMI, Altria, Reynolds, and Turning Point. So we're hoping to see some decisions by the end of the year for those, and I think that will hopefully open up the doors for some other products in the category. We also have Europe, which is currently governed by TPD, although as was being just discussed, that is undergoing some revisions. There also have been some countries that have gone above and beyond, and they are creating their own regulations, one of which is France, who I'm sure a lot of people in this room have seen. They are trying to ban all nicotine pouches, and it is currently, as of 2026, will have a higher fine than carrying heroin. So I think we're in a really interesting time when it comes to regulations and making sure that the new regulations, as they're adopted, make sense for the product category. And then we also have countries like Sweden, where we've seen very successful regulation of nicotine pouches, where you've lowered the smoking rate to under 5% and essentially eliminated combusted cigarettes because of their successful pathway. So there's a lot of changes. There's some countries also, Australia being one, that's really where pouches are a medicinal product. So you will need a prescription in order to access them. And Canada has recently transferred to that similar pathway, although they do have a natural health products pathway. So there's a lot of different regulations currently in the world. And I think we're seeing, with the rise in nicotine pouch usage, we're seeing those regulations evolve quite quickly. And as we're seeing, not always based in the science and harm reduction.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it, Sydney? Because you spoke there about the whole gamut of regulation that exists. In the US, you've got almost not pharmaceutical-like, but obviously a framework that's based on what you would do for pharma. And on the other hand, you've got countries like France that just banned the product completely. And there seems to be a lot of uncertainty, doesn't there, around the toxicity of nicotine. And Paweł, I wanted to ask you if you could just give us your view on what you believe the toxicity of nicotine actually is.
Sure. So I think one of the main problems when it comes to the toxicity of nicotine is still there is a stigma connected to nicotine because in the minds of a lot of people, still the toxicity of nicotine is related to tobacco. And first off, let's separate smoking tobacco, because the toxicity of smoking tobacco, like carcinogenity of it, that comes from a lot of combustion products, right? But there's still a huge difference between tobacco-based products, like for chewing or snorting, and nicotine-based products, like for vaping, for instance, or nicotine pouches, right? So in tobacco, aside from nicotine, there are a lot of other compounds, and many of them are also psychoactive, and they modulate the effects of nicotine. A major group of compounds of this kind are, for example, hormones, which are blocking the enzymes which break down neurotransmitters like dopamine or noradrenaline, and nicotine acts by releasing these neurotransmitters. So when you block these enzymes, then you have increased effects of nicotine and for a longer time. So it's more addictive, right, and stronger. When we consider nicotine in nicotine pouches or chewing or vaping products, you don't have that. You just have nicotine itself. And when it comes to the toxicity of nicotine, I think we should mainly focus on its cardiovascular effects. These come from the same action on those neurotransmitters, because nicotine acts both in the brain but also peripherally, right? So it releases adrenaline, it increases blood pressure, and so on. So what we should focus on when it comes to toxicity of nicotine is making people aware that how much they use directly impacts how it affects them.
Cool, that's really interesting, Paweł. So, I mean, given the misalignment in global regulations around the world that you spoke about, Sydney, and Paweł, essentially what you're saying is that there is a conflation of the toxicity of nicotine with cigarette smoke, which we all know is toxic. My question, and I think it's a really important point, Joel, and I'm going to see what you think about this. What can innovation look like in the oral nicotine space? Can you give us some insights into where innovation is currently heading, given these constraints and conflation of toxicity of nicotine?
Yeah, and I'll answer it. There's two distinctly different answers, whether we're talking about the pharmaceutical side of the fence or the recreational, non-pharmaceutical side of the fence. I'll just talk about today. So I've spoken to about 12 or 13 pouch companies downstairs this morning, and I asked them what's their point of difference. All of them but two said flavors. So if everybody's point of difference is the same, that's not a good category to be in. So I think the innovation has to focus on something that's sustainable. You know, ultimately everything's a business and you need something sustainable. I think the biggest challenges on the recreational side, one is just pure ethical considerations. You know, there are a lot of consumers out there that want stronger, faster hits, you know, greater area under the curve, prolonged, you know, strength. I think there has to be some common sense there. I love the foundation of oral nicotine being in harm reduction. I think that's of critical importance for every entrant in the category. So if you're transitioning someone from cigarette smoking, there has to be some common sense on what is the nicotine delivery of a cigarette versus the nicotine delivery of pouch. And to go from whatever you think the cigarette is, you know, 15, 20 milligrams, depends who you believe, to a pouch with significantly more than that, I don't think that's the sustainable innovation that the category should hope for. And to be honest, I think the healthiness, the long-term sustainability of the category depends on self-regulation. You know, in markets where you can do super high strength or other, you know, innovative products in terms of standing out, it's going to bring down the category because ultimately the regulations are going to catch up. There's going to be adverse events. Something bad is going to happen, and everyone in the oral nicotine category is going to suffer. So you got to self-police. It's all about figuring out a right way to meet consumers' needs without going to extremities. And I think that's of critical importance on the recreational side. The pharmaceutical side is very different. And the main reason for the pharmaceutical side is different, mainly two reasons. One is the strength is capped. You know, oral nicotine products outside of the UK, where it can be 6 milligrams, everywhere else is 4. And in a lot of markets, even a 4 milligram product is RX. So it's a completely different sandbox you have to play in on the RX side. The needs of the consumers are very similar. They want a faster craving relief, they want more nicotine, faster. So the challenge there, which is significantly less commercial and more scientific, is given a 4 milligram ceiling, how do I deliver that 4 milligrams faster? And how do I deliver more of the 4 milligrams over the 15, 20 minutes the consumer is going to engage with the oral product? When you spit out a piece of NRT gum, about a quarter of the nicotine is still in the gum. So can we take that quarter and release it while people chew? Can you come up with some other oral mechanism that has the PK curve, you know, the hit of nicotine similar to a spray? Consumers who use an oral spray generally don't like using it. It's a very specific burn, it's very localized, they're hard to use correctly, especially because nobody reads instructions. Everybody assumes they know how to use a spray. Half the people in this room, if I asked how do you use a spray, or for that matter, how you chew nicotine gum, you're going to give me the wrong answer. There are instructions on how to chew nicotine gum. You do not chew it like a regular piece of gum, but nobody knows that, because why would you read the instructions on gum? So the challenge is to figure out a way to mirror the benefits people want from the faster spray, but in an oral format without the negatives. And that's an enigma, that's a puzzle. There are products out there that are starting down that pathway, but for NRT to survive, that innovation has to be created. And the constraints, at least in Europe certainly, you can't go more than 4 milligrams. You have a very limited window of what the PK curve can look like before you have to go down the NDA route, which most companies will shy away from because of the risk and cost. So that's a big challenge, but NRT needs that to survive. And then the only thing I just want to note is if you marry the two sides of that fence I just spoke about, and again, it's about self-policing. In markets like France, or Germany for that matter today, where the recreational pouches are illegal. The US, there's a very long drawn-out process, hopefully getting better, but nevertheless, the pathway to register an NRT pouch is very established and very simple. It is not hard science. You do a bioequivalent study to a nicotine gum, and you're in. 12 to 18 months. Very low risk, very low cost. But the self-policing aspect is people cannot use that as a loophole. So if I want to launch a pouch in France as a recreational pouch, I can't do it today. If I want to launch an NRT pouch in France, I can start the process today and launch within 2 years. But once that pouch is on the French market, it has to be NRT. And the self-policing aspect is, don't register an NRT product, get it in the market, and then flip the switch and start marketing it as recreational. Everyone in this room loses if people take advantage of that scenario.
Thank you, Joel. That's really interesting. I want to just spin back and focus on the consumer side for a second, because obviously that's, I think, where most of our audience is today. And you brought up a couple of important points, or more than a couple of important points, but the two that I picked up on, and we were sort of discussing outside before we came in. You know, some of the really high nicotine strength products, it's just, I mean, like, you know, unbelievable. I think we were saying the highest that we've seen here is 80. I think, you know, a GINN recommendation is that 20 mg per mil should be the highest concentration. Even that, I think, is a high estimate. You know, 14 to 16 seems to be the sweet spot for really heavy smokers in order for them to be able to switch. But I guess, you know, the reason that companies are going for these high strength nicotines, 80, 90, 150 in some cases, is because there is obviously the manufacturers see a demand for that in the consumer marketplace. Now, whether that's demand heeded on sensible science or sensible knowledge, I don't know. But it kind of leads me to think, and you know, I'd like to hear from each of you guys. What do you think is the societal view of nicotine in general? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it indifferent? If people are asking for more and higher and higher nicotine pouch strengths, you would suggest that they think that's an okay thing. But what do you think is the sort of societal view on nicotine?
Yeah, so generally I think the perception, the societal perception of nicotine is positive. Like, it's headed in a good direction, in that people try to educate themselves more and more, like understanding differences between the effects of tobacco and nicotine-based products, like I mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, I think there's still a big lack of resources, like reliable resources, for people to educate themselves. But still, like, the mere fact that we're here, I think that's a good sign that we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think that there is still a huge amount of misinformation in this space, and some of that is caused by the limitations that are put on manufacturers and the limited amount of research that they're able to distribute to consumers on the health risks, and therefore limiting the product. We've also seen that there's still a huge amount of misinformation in the physician community, where there's, I believe it's over 80% of physicians still believe that nicotine is a carcinogen itself, that carried over from combusted cigarettes. So I think this is a really great area that there's groups like GINN can help, is to kind of marry the consumer education aspect and the science that's going on. I do think that there are some positives in this space. We recently saw in a press conference that was given by Chuck Schumer, where he went after ZYN and wanted the FDA to look into it, that's concerned about health risks. And the amount of pushback that came out of that press conference shows that there is a changing perception on the health risks of nicotine. The consumers are starting to understand that this is a reduced risk product. So I think that that's a really positive trend, and it's about continuing that consumer education so that, and again, I mean, that's, some of it is, as scientists, we're used to going through scientific research publications. They're not the easiest to make it through. So if we can have organizations like GINN help disseminate that information to the general public and also to the regulatory bodies, because I think a lot of them are not seeing the same information that we see within this community.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing, I agree that the need for nicotine to be, you know, destigmatized is nicotine has to be looked at in isolation. You know, the second the word cigarette comes up in the discussion, nicotine just falls down. And I think that is getting better, more understood both on the consumer and the professional side. But to me, the big issue about nicotine is context of the nicotine. And again, as you walk around the halls downstairs, in a lab, you can pick two products that in that lab environment run a couple tests. The lab will say these two products are absolutely identical. But to a consumer, product A and product B, they would absolutely say that whether it's the branding, the language used, the positioning, the imagery, they would say that product B is significantly less harmful or more harmful than product A, even though they're identical. And I'll give you one quantitative example that I was involved in on this. We did a study with 2,000 consumers in the Nordic regions. I'm based in Sweden, as my accent you can tell. We engaged 2,000 smokers, and we said that on a harm scale, cigarettes are 100, as bad as it can be, and nicotine-free is 0. And we gave them about a dozen products in between. We said from 100 to 0, tell me what you think the health risk of these products are. Two of the products that were on there, one was an NRT pouch, which exists in Scandinavia. It's the only place where you can actually get a registered pharmaceutical in the pouch format. And we also had, I don't remember whether it was Zinn or Lift, but in a lab, the Zonic NRT pouch and the Zinn or Lift are basically the same. The only difference is flavoring, really. They're the same strength, same everything. Consumers put the recreational pouch at 44, with the cigarette at 100. The NRT pouch they put at 14. That is a huge gap for two products that are identical scientifically. So nicotine we have to remove from cigarettes, but we always have to understand that consumers don't see nicotine in a vacuum. The context of how it's presented is what matters. And that's something that, it's not unique to nicotine, but I think it's important for everyone who's in the nicotine business to understand that to say it's X milligrams is not the entire story.
Yeah, just one sentence, because I would want to stress here that nicotine is not a carcinogen itself, because I think this is the very first information that should get to people if we want to help them switch from smoking to smokeless.
Cool. So, changing gears slightly here. I've spoken to a lot of manufacturers over the years, first in vape products and now in nicotine pouches, and ultimately the conversation always ends up going to the US market. The US market is the one that everyone wants to crack. It is the biggest market in the world. It is also probably one of the hardest markets to get into under the current PMTA process. And Joel, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Given that the process in the US is so long, so comprehensive, and the FDA is taking forever to review applications, or even to accept applications, how does that connect with an industry which is very fast moving, very fast paced, wants to innovate, wants to come up with new things? How can you innovate in an environment like the US and the PMTA process? Is it possible even?
It's a tough question. First, I think the process in the US, whether proactively or reactively, is going to dramatically change over the next couple of months. I love the game of poker that's going on right now between some of the big behemoth companies and the FDA. The FDA has not followed through on what they said they would do, and companies are calling their bluff right now. So I think that's great. In terms of aside from the regulations, so if it's a playing field where people can enter freely, first of all, as long as it's harm reduction, I don't care. I'll just throw that out there. If people are trading from cigarettes to whatever works, I'm fine with that, and that's the first box we need to check.
Just want to interrupt you there. Is switching from a cigarette to an 18 mg nicotine pouch harm reduction in your book?
Yes,
Okay.
100%. Switching from a non-pulp, switching from a vape to an oral, I think is harm reduction flat out.
Okay.
Like you said before, let's get rid of nicotine and get rid of burning,
Yeah.
get rid of the lungs, start moving in the right direction. But in terms of winning in the US is a tough market because it flips. Despite the fact that it's so complex and there's so many critical retailers you have to understand and have relationships with, if you come up with the new mousetrap, you can go from nothing to market leader almost overnight in the US. There's no loyalty, especially with the retailers. If there's a new thing that meets all their needs and consumers seem to gravitate towards it, they will invest behind it. And the amount of money up for grabs with this category in the US no one will be gun shy about placing bets. So, you know, my theory is it cannot be flavors and it cannot be branding. It just can't. Those are not sustainable. So, you know, the win has to be a better delivery system, a benefit that is not aesthetic only. You have to have a tangible, defensible point of difference. And if it's your branding or it's your flavor, months later, everyone's just going to see what's winning and copy it. It just doesn't work. So I don't know the answer, at least on the recreational side. On the pharma side, I can talk for longer than you want me to. But I think it's a very big challenge, and I would argue that the overwhelming number of companies, majority of companies in the category today, I would say are just placing the wrong bets.
Joel, you alluded to it in what you said just there in terms of the poker game that Altria and Reynolds are playing with the FDA. Sydney, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, you know, being in the regulatory space. What do you think about that poker game that's being played, and what gives Altria and Reynolds, do you think, the mandate to do that, and does that change it for other companies going forward?
Of course. So I think it's really important to understand how we got here. And going back to it, I think that there's really two key factors that play into this. There's the lack of enforcement on illicit products that have no intention of complying within the space. And then there's also the lack of timely authorizations that we know has happened with the FDA. So the FDA is mandated by Section 910 of the FD&C Act to issue decisions within 180 days of receipt of an application. We all know that's not the case. So as was mentioned, we have some of the big giants that are challenging the FDA. And it's going to play out in two ways. Either the FDA is going to choose to enforce against these companies, and it's going to be battled out in the courtroom, which is not my area of expertise, but I'm sure there's some lawyers out there. And it probably will be a prolonged battle, or they will choose not to act. But I think that it's really important that we understand the basis of these two applications that we're talking about is they have substantive scientific findings. These are not what we call skinny PMTAs. These are true PMTAs. They address all of the required elements in the PMTA final rule, and they also include the studies that we've seen just in practice that FDA wants. So I think that we will get some answers and some clarity based on how this is handled pretty soon. But it's a really interesting time to come into this space because of that clarity that we're going to get. So I think it's a very interesting move, and I'm excited to see how it plays out, and will also not just benefit the big giants, but also smaller companies as well.
Fantastic. I want to go back to the days of vape, when e-cigarettes were the major product driving the nicotine market. I would say undoubtedly that's now shifting towards nicotine pouches. But go back 3, 4, 5 years, there was a little game being played, wasn't there, between tobacco-derived nicotine and synthetic nicotine. And I guess, you know, Paweł, I think you're the best person to answer this or talk about it. Is a similar game being played out in the nicotine pouch space? And actually, is there a difference between the toxicities when you compare tobacco-derived nicotine and synthetic nicotine?
So the short answer is we should treat both forms of nicotine the same, because basically nicotine is nicotine, right? But the longer answer is a bit more nuanced. As some of you probably know, and it showed up with synthetic nicotine, there are two forms of nicotine, S-nicotine and R-nicotine, right? And what you have in tobacco, that's S-nicotine, like mostly, like 99% of nicotine in tobacco is S-nicotine. And synthetic nicotine can be either S-nicotine or R-nicotine, or it can be a 50-50 combination of both, or any ratio that you could imagine. So when it comes to S-nicotine, when it's synthetic or tobacco-derived, we should treat it the same. But as we've seen like a few years ago, there were a lot of products flooding the market with racemic nicotine or various ratios of both forms in the products when it was based on synthetic nicotine. And these two forms actually are very different when it comes to their pharmacology. When it comes to S-nicotine, we know a lot of it, right? It's one of the best studied psychoactive compounds. And when it comes to R-nicotine, that's not the same, right? Even when we look at the activation of nicotinic receptors, which is the primary channel through which nicotine works, S-nicotine is about 10 times more potent than R-nicotine. But that doesn't mean that R-nicotine is weaker or doesn't have the toxicity associated with it. We just don't know that much information about it. Actually, there are some studies that show that R-nicotine is a compound that blocks the enzymes which break down acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is another neurotransmitter which is, among other things, involved in mental impairments diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia. We see that there is a deficit of these neurotransmitters in the synapses, and compounds that block such enzymes breaking down this acetylcholine. This is one of the group of drugs that are currently used in the pharmacology to counteract the effects of these diseases. So we will probably see more and more R-nicotine appearing on the market, and I think we need more and more research into this form of nicotine. And yeah, well, you also mentioned toxicity, right? So I would also like to stress that the source of nicotine, whether it is tobacco or synthesis, that doesn't really define on its own the toxicity of nicotine. You can have this is mainly based on the process, on the technological process producing both. You can have a high quality tobacco-based nicotine. You can have a high quality synthetic nicotine, right? Or you can have a very impure nicotine, either from tobacco or synthetic nicotine. So we should focus on making those technological processes driven towards high purity nicotine, basically.
Awesome, fantastic. I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes each, and I'm going to say to you, imagine someone came to you and gave you $50 million or pounds or euros to launch a nicotine pouch. What would you do? How would you do it? And how could organizations like GINN potentially help you along the way? I don't know, who wants to go first?
I'll go first because I'm going to cheat. If I had 50 million, so like I said, I've been running NRT businesses on the commercial side for over a decade now. Globally, it's a $2.5 billion business with a 3 to 5% success rate. It's pathetic. It's embarrassing. Any other, if 3% of the time you took a headache pill, your headache went away, that category would disappear. If you had a stomach ache and 3% of the time you chewed something, your stomach ache went away, that category would disappear. So if I had $50 million, I would fix that problem for NRT. And the way I fix it is product agnostic. Whether it's a gum, a lozenge, a pouch, doesn't matter. It's a very low amount of nicotine, too low to be effective, to be honest. But that's what the regulations are, and so, can't argue with that. The reason NRT doesn't work, and what I would spend the money on, is a lot of people don't understand why they smoke. And all the companies in the world, the Nicorettes, the Nicotinells, brands I've run, all of our TV commercials are, you need to quit smoking. They know they need to quit smoking. They don't know how. And the main reason they don't know how to quit smoking is they don't know why they smoke in the first place. There's 5 or 6 generally accepted buckets of triggers that enable people to smoke. One of them is chemical. Social, behavioral, stress. There's all these other things. Until you know how much of your pie is which trigger, you cannot solve the problem. So somebody who's a 100% social smoker only smokes when they're around their friends NRT gum is irrelevant for that person because they have no chemical problem whatsoever. But everybody goes to NRT, which is why its success rate is so painfully low. So if you give me $50 million, I'm going to figure out how to monetize behavioral health married to NRT, figure out what people's pies look like, and help them quit smoking by having a quit journey, a strategy, with NRT as a component, but has those other triggers dealt with. Right now, people try to deal with one trigger for a 5 or 6 trigger problem, and it just doesn't work.
No, Joel, I think that's a fantastic point, and I just wanted to sort of just piggyback on that a little bit, because it's a conversation I was having a couple of weeks ago with a colleague in the industry, actually, and the analogy that he used was, I thought, a fantastic one. He was saying, why is it I can be in the south of France, in the beautiful countryside, having a bottle of red wine, and it tastes one way, and then I buy a bottle of that, take it home to rainy Glasgow, and it tastes completely different. And I think, you know, smoking, there's an element of that when it comes to smoking as well. I think, you know, what we've done for too long as an industry in terms of the consumer side and an industry in terms of the NRT side is think it's all about the nicotine addiction. But there are so many sensory components that we're just not looking at when it comes to delivering an experience to people so that they will actually want to quit smoking. The most successful, I think, alternative product is going to be a product that people use because they want to use it, not because it's the next best thing to smoking. And I think we kind of, for the last, as I say, 20, 25 years that I've been involved in tobacco harm reduction, we're trapped in a cycle of trying to mimic a cigarette. And I think and that's only on the nicotine delivery. And I think it's much, much bigger than that no one has really looked at. Sydney, $50 million for you.
Sure. So I guess with my 50 million, I would be interested in trying to get the best ROI on that. That's
Notice
the
I
goal
didn't
of
say that.
business. It's true. I mean, without it, your business is going to fail. So I would go about seeing where there's overlap in different markets to try and gain market share. There's a lot of things that are, you know, for PMTA, we know it's a long road currently. We'll see how that changes. But there are some basic things, just even from a product stewardship standpoint, that are really crucial. Knowing your HPHCs, looking at toxicity, knowing your stability. Some of these studies are not going to go away. And there is a way to design studies so that they can be used not just for your PMTA. They could be used to enter other markets, to start generating revenue, to continue the different applications. That way you can gain traction internationally in multiple different markets. You can tweak your product along the way, and you can do some very good product stewardship, making sure that your product is, you know, something that consumers are going to use time and time again, and they're going to have the same experience, because otherwise that's going to drive those consumers away. So I think that getting some of this basic data and designing those studies, making sure they're designed well, and being able to leverage those in multiple markets is really critical. So I'd probably start there.
Awesome. Paweł?
Yeah, so tough question for me actually, because I'm not a businessman. As you know, I'm a scientist. And if I had a $50 million to start a business like that, the first thing I would do would be to create a research center and bring together scientists from all over the world that are devoted to discovering the truth and then showing this truth to the people. And when it comes to the business side, I guess I would just hire people that I work with for the finances, strategy, marketing, because honestly, these are one of the best people that I've met in my life.
Thank you so much, guys. Before I wrap up, I want to ask the audience if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to answer them if we can. Any questions from anyone?
So going back to the question around what we're seeing play out with Altria and BAT right now, in the scenario that Sydney mentioned, if FDA chooses not to enforce against those who are bringing products to market 180 days after submission, what do we think that world would look like?
Who wants to take that? Sydney, you want to take it?
I I can take it. I think that it's eventually going to, if that's the case, going to look more similar to the notification process that is currently in place in a lot of different countries. So it would still, again, you would have the substantive scientific information, and it would be a notification rather than an application and waiting for that to be authorized.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Sydney. I think, you know, it changes, doesn't it, from an authorization market. And I think what's important, and I think what will actually buy a lot of heed with the FDA and gain a lot of credibility for companies is if you got the data to show that actually your product is reduced risk, and you know, we know it's going to be reduced risk to smoking cigarettes. You don't need a 20,000-page document to say that it's safer than smoking, right? But if you've got the data, and you've got particular data around Module 5, which is a perception behavior, and it's showing that you're going to market it in an appropriate way, and it's not going to appeal to youth and stuff, and you do decide to go down, you know, the Reynolds or Ultra route of just launching it anyway and wait to see what happens, I think it'd be very difficult for the FDA to enforce against you if you've got the data and if you can show responsible marketing.
And I mean, I completely agree. I think that's the reason why Altria and Reynolds are able to
Right.
do what they're doing,
Right.
is because they have that data and they know going in that if it goes to the courts, which it might, that they have the data to back it up. They did, and then, you know, they will look through all of the application and review it based on the scientific evidence that's there. So I don't think they would do it without that.
Absolutely. Any other questions from the audience? I'll just go to the gentleman in the back. I'll come back.
For emerging markets, for the nicotine pouch business, for example, Latin America, some countries are starting to propose new regulations. Mexico, they're proposing very high taxes, but exceptions for NRT products, approved NRT products by health authorities. Now they need to figure out the standards for for said products. Besides, I guess, capped strengths and maybe no flavors at all or only certain flavors, are there any other standards that they might either replicate from other countries or maybe come figure out their own? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you kind of two answers to that question. And I apologize, I'm not familiar with the Mexican market at all. Whatever people choose to do, as long as they trade from a cigarette, I'm kind of okay with that. So I understand the, you know, the flavor bans, the packaging, the behind the counter, no advertising, strength limits, all of that stuff. I get it. You know, lots of markets have played with all of these variables. To me, that's all fine, I guess. I think a lot of it lacks common sense. If the goal, and again, NRT by design, is to get people to quit smoking. So as long as you take an adult smoker who wants to quit, I think the government has to enable that person to find a product that enables them to do that. So my sort of sentence is purchasing NRT should be as easy as purchasing a cigarette. And that's country specific. So if cigarettes are behind the counter, hidden, et cetera, it kind of makes sense that they can treat NRT the same way. If you can buy a pack of cigarettes everywhere, you should be allowed to buy NRT everywhere. Countries don't do that, unfortunately. The second answer that I have is in markets where certain oral formats are not allowed, again, using NRT as a loophole to launch a recreational product and enable entry to nicotine is wrong. Full stop. And you have to balance those two things. Because if pouch is a great format, no one denies that pouch is a phenomenal format. You know, I'm assuming pouches are illegal in Mexico, I don't know, but for this answer, let's assume they are. You launch an NRT pouch, massive people will quit smoking. Great. Some people are going to enter nicotine through that pouch. And you got to figure out a way to maximize one and minimize the other. And it's a tough challenge. And it's across all the functions of the company, marketing, distribution, finance. Government's taxing it does not solve anything. It actually makes the problem worse, because then you're just enabling the black market when no one controls anything. But very positive in harm reduction while simultaneously negative in entry to nicotine.
Hi everyone, this is Erika from Imperial Brands. So thank you so much everyone for your very inspiring panel. So I want just to go back to one of the comments saying that of course consumers know that cigarettes are harmful. We don't know how to transition them away from cigarettes. I believe that over the last 5 years we have really seen like a shift in the way in which consumers, like cigarette smokers, are looking at NGP products. So they are very interested to understand what is the, the potential harmful effect of each of these products on the risk scale. So my question is, what do you think as scientists we can do to really reach this population? So I understand this is a really good opportunity to speak about science and to engage in the industry. But what we can really do to speak with a cigarette smoker and explain what happens if they use heated tobacco, they move across the risk scale till nicotine pouches and RT. So I would like to ask your opinion.
Sure. I have a couple comments. So I think that it's really interesting and it's great. I mean, we are starting to see a change in demographics when we look at the profile of a combusted cigarette smoker versus an oral product user. We're seeing a higher education level overall, so that you have consumers that are able to better translate what they're reading and choose the products accordingly. Again, I think that a lot of companies, manufacturers are limited in what you can share, and there is still a stigma to industry-funded research just because of the name being on there. So I think that finding ways, whether it's through GINN or through other organizations or communities or even conferences like this, just to share that information, to disseminate it to the public is really important, so it's not as scientific as well.
And if I could just add one sentence to that is, if the onus falls upon the marketers, it will never happen. The ROI of educating consumers is infinitely smaller than the ROI on TV advertising. And ultimately, those are the trade-offs. So, educating consumers in any category, any OTC category, is exceptionally slow, high risk, and expensive. So I agree, it's third parties, it's get the noise out there, because the companies just aren't going to do it.
I'm going to ask the question slightly differently. I agree with everything that you guys said, right? I'm not going to disagree, but having worked at BAT, PMI during the ICOS years, and then Imperial Brands, I think the way in which we communicate about the risk of products and the switching journey that people should take is the wrong way around. So, back in the day when I was at PMI and we were launching ICOS, it was always about heated tobacco is the best thing because it's the closest experience to a cigarette. Then it was, well, actually, you could use e-cigarettes because now you have a way of not using tobacco but still getting a nicotine hit but through inhalation. And then we're now at the point where it's all about nicotine pouches. My advice to any consumer or any smoker that would come to me would be to say to them, if you smoke, you should quit, X, Y, and Z reasons why. We all know them anyway, but I'll let me explain it to them again. But I would actually advise them to go for the nicotine pouches. And if nicotine pouches don't work for them, then to begin to escalate up the risk scale. I think for too long as an industry we've talked about de-escalation of risk, but I think now we've got to switch the conversation to people who are smoking, haven't quit, they need to start with the lowest risk product, and then only if that doesn't work for them in terms of giving them the satisfaction should they begin to escalate their risk level again. So I think there is a way in which the narrative has been told that's probably not quite right for achieving the harm reduction that we want to achieve.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of sentences to this. Well, what's the reason why people are more inclined to use tobacco rather than nicotine-based products, right? So what we did with nicotine-based products was basically we took nicotine out of tobacco and made it into a product without other compounds from tobacco. So maybe let's look more deeply into what's in tobacco that makes it more appealing to some populations than nicotine, basically. And if we find it, maybe we could add some options for people who have trouble quitting smoking or any other tobacco-based products, and make it an option for them.
And one more key thing is these products have to be available. So I think it's really important to stop the trend that we're seeing with outright bans, because if you take away nicotine pouches, you're taking away one option from a smoker that wants to switch to a reduced risk alternative. So I think it's really important, especially right now with TPD3 coming out, especially seeing what we're seeing around the globe with the regulation and flavor bans, to use science and to push back and to make sure that we are keeping these products available.
Fantastic. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so are there any final questions before I try and wrap up what has been, I think, a fantastic discussion between these three panelists? So I'm going to walk away today thinking that actually nicotine pouches, are the future for the category. I think, the consumer market is definitely something which can't go away. It has to stay. It is the obvious choice for people to switch to as compared to nicotine replacement therapy. We need to be very responsible as an industry and self-police ourselves. Call out the players that actually we feel are not behaving in the interests of the industry. And of course, even us with our $50 million each would want to eventually launch in the US, and there seems to be that's going to change. And actually, if we've got confidence in the data set that we generate around our products, we may be able to go down the route Ultra and Reynolds have gone down, which is submit, wait 180 days, don't get a reply, launch anyway, and see what happens. That seems to be like an option which is emerging, and I think probably will be the case going forward. And I think, in my role as part of GINN, who helped organize this panel session today, I think really just trying to get out there and trying to educate not only consumers, but also, as we saw in the previous talk, regulators and politicians about what pouches actually are, what they mean, what the risk profile really is all going to change the needle. So I think, all in all, thank you so much, guys, for taking part in the panel today. Thank you all for listening so much and your questions, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.